welcome to the 10th edition of the Future of Education Summit on CNBC Africa. I'm Godfrey Mutizwa and your host for the day. We are joined by an international audience on the Ring Central virtual platform. Now, the theme for the day is Education Renaissance, charting a sustainable future for Africa. We move on to a discussion which will be moderated by CNBC Africa's Editor-in-Chief, Godfrey Mutizwa. The topic is Partnerships for Impact, strengthening collaboration between governments, academia, civil society, private sector, and international organizations to drive collective action. Let's meet the panelists.
The panelists are Prof. Ama Kaka, President and Pro-Vice Chancellor at Curtin University, Dubai. Prof. Mark E. Smith, CBE, President and Vice Chancellor at the University of Southampton. Prof. Adam Habib, Vice Chancellor, SOAS University of London. And Sneha Shah, Board Member at the African Leadership Foundation and Education Development Center.
What does the fracturing of the global political and economic order, the split between West and East, North and South, and developing and developed nations have to do with building partnerships to advance education, you may ask? In my humble view, precisely the kind of regression that we don't need, and therefore construction of perhaps the strongest case for building platforms, standards and pathways we need to advance education, from our little speck on Mother Earth among the 200 billion galaxies in our universe. Welcome to the conversation on partnerships for impact, strengthening the collaboration between governments, academic, civil society, private sector, and international organizations. Professors Kaka, Smith, Habib, and Sneha, please make the case for me. And let me start with you, Professor Habib. Your opening thoughts on the kind of platforms and the kind of collaborations that we need to advance education.
So let me kick off by saying that I think we've been building partnerships for at least, for much more longer, but at least on an accelerated arrangement for at least 30, 35 years. But I think that the global academy is as divided as it is, and we are as polarized as we are, and that these partnerships in the main do not work to the advantage of significant institutions and the populations of the global South, what I call the majoritarian world. If you look at where I am in the United Kingdom, what we have is effectively a higher education system that claims to work in the interests of the global academy. But it really is there to overcharge students from the global South so that it can cross-subsidize the research activities of academics in the global North and to cross-subsidize domestic students in the global North. And so the fact that international students for a master's degree in engineering could pay up to £45,000 just tuition in the UK, when the domestic counterparts would pay at least less than half of that, is something that we should be very, very concerned about. And so we do need to start thinking about creating business models of global partnerships that are equitable, that are more fairer, and that are pedagogically more sound. Because if you look at our challenges, all of them are transnational in character: climate change, war, renewable energy. And if you're going to find solutions to that, you need both global science and technology, but you also need local knowledge. How you manage a pandemic in the middle of New York City will be different to how you do it in Tokyo. And so you need institutional relationships that bring comparative global knowledge and local knowledge in conversation into each other. Yeah. The time when a Cambridge or an Oxford or a SOAS trained the world's elite is way past. And what we do need is global partnerships in which we take collective responsibility to train the professionals of the 21st century, that brings local and global together, that creates business models that are more empowering. And I think that that's the real need that we've confronted all across the world.
Yeah, I'm going to come back and ask you what we need to build those partnerships and who needs to do what for us to be able to construct those partnerships. Professor Smith, I'm going to stay in the United Kingdom and ask you for your opening thoughts.
Yeah, so good morning, and it's great to be here. So thanks for the opportunity. Clearly, with a kind of global economy now, education has its kind of role to play in that. And I think one of the key things is to have differentiated models of partnership. And we can talk to some of the issues that Professor Habib has rightly raised. But I also want to kind of emphasize the point about partnership locally, because universities, particularly global universities, can often look past their local communities, and playing a role with the local community is a key partnership as well. And therefore, partnership starts at home, really. And one thing that's happened to many UK universities, particularly regional UK universities, like my own at Southampton, is that it's been in a place where it's got much closer to local government in recent years. Because you could argue that a global university is effectively considering the kind of breadth of its activities across the world. But if it's not seen to play and value and be of value to the local community that it interacts with on a daily basis, that's a very shaky place to start with. And UK universities have got very much better at that. And therefore, I think that's a place to start. And then going back to the point about being kind of looking at partnerships globally, clearly, coming to the UK for an education is very expensive. But one of the things that we need to do is we need to think about what the in-country offering that we can offer from a university like Southampton would be, that's at a very much more equitable price. And that's something that many universities are thinking about more carefully. And it's to kind of export that, but export it in the local context, because delivering something always has to have that local context, and that's what partnership is about.
Sure. Thanks for that, Professor Smith. Now, I'm not too sure what to say, Professor Kaka, given you are somewhere in the middle. So I don't know whether we still speak about the North and the South, or we still maybe just say Middle Earth. Your opening thoughts?
No, absolutely. I totally agree with Professor Smith about actually the power of actually moving education around the world and moving top quality education around the world, and through transnational education and so on. But obviously we are facing global challenges, climate change, social inequalities, and of course the rapid and transformational development in technology, which undoubtedly is having and will have repercussions on the job market, and creating uncertainty around the world. And of course, research and research partnership going to play a major role in addressing these challenges, providing solutions. But I'm a strong believer that the key element there is actually in talent development. Developing the human capital is going to be the key issue really going around and across the globe. So how do we actually develop professionals with the right skills, the right mindset? How do they become good citizens? And also innovators, entrepreneurs. There's obviously shortages of jobs, high unemployment. So we really want to create more job creators than just job seekers. I think we cannot do it on our own. Universities cannot do this all on our own. So hence the need for partnerships, across other universities globally, but also of course governments, private sector industries, and many other types of organizations. In fact, actually, in my university, partnership is actually one of 3 pillars of our vision statement, and definitely our strategy for 2023. So personally, I've been working in the transnational education context for the past 15 years. So, really, really, although, establishing, partnerships in foreign countries is challenging. However, it's absolutely essential and rewarding, but also it's also rewarding to the entire global university, not just the local operation.
Absolutely. Let me bring in Sneha Shah here. You have been listening to them, and I think if I can perhaps summarize what they are all saying is that collaboration is required, but you're living it already, aren't you? Let's get your thoughts.
Absolutely. I think one of the things, if you just zoom out to what everyone's saying, what they're all saying is the pace of change in the world has never been faster, and it's never going to be as sort of slow again. So we're moving in an accelerated world. The world sort of problems are changing really fast. The sort of pace of change in the sort of the way you think about employment, the way that we're thinking about climate change, the way that we're thinking about politics, all of that is accelerating. And I think what everyone's saying is that no one player can do this by themselves, and no one player can keep up by themselves. And so we need systems level change, and we need disruptive thinkers to work together with platforms that already access, all the sort of people that we need to have impact with. And so one of the sort of organizations that I work very closely with, EDC, I'm on the board of trustees, it's Educational Development Center, and their entire mission is an example of how you can have platforms for collaboration. And what they do is they work together with organizations like USAID, with local school systems, with local governments, with private sector, to try and drive systems level change, not just in education, but also in health, because we know that health outcomes impact education outcomes. And if a child is not healthy, or if they're not eating, they can't be mentally healthy enough to be able to study. And then they also work to provide economic opportunity, because when you educate people, to Professor Kakar's point, you're not educating them just to be job seekers. You're going to educate them also to become entrepreneurs that are solving some of these big global challenges. And so, finding platforms like EDC, there are many others that are working together with both public, private sector, civil society, startups, to actually try and make those changes. I think that's the way forward.
I wanted you to develop a little bit your idea around systems change. I want to understand at what level you're doing that. And then I also wanted to talk a little bit about the other part that you touched on, which is the platforms. Is that bilateral? Is that national? Is that international? How do we do it best?
I think to the sort of second question, it has to be all of it. And I think, you have to have bilateral in local communities where that, for example, in Kenya, some of the big tech companies are working with the Kenyan government to improve digital literacy. And that's very much bilateral. And then you have to have multinational, international, where you're trying to do systems level change. And when I say systems level, I mean, really, if you think about what we're in a moment in the global education system where there are multiple threats to the way that we've already thought about education. So the way that we test for knowledge has completely changed with AI. The way that we're teaching people for jobs has completely changed with what's happening in the global economy. The way that we're sort of talking about the impact of climate change on everyone's daily lives has completely changed what we're teaching students in schools. And so systems level change means you have to change the curriculums, you have to train the teachers, you have to change the environment in which these kids are learning, and you have to provide access to technology in even the furthest reach sort of areas where there's very little access. You have to provide access. And that's really what systems level change is about.
And I was wondering when AI was going to make an entrance into the room, because this is what this is all about, isn't it? But before we go there, Professor Habib, if I can come to you, I wanted to explore a little bit how perhaps the geopolitics of our time complicates what we are talking about here.
I think it complicates it in a really serious way. Most of our education systems are managed by national governments. And national governments have national agendas, as they should. They are elected by the electorate. And they look through the challenges that we confront through their national lens. And that's the dilemma, because there may be a tension between what is required at the national level and what is required at the global level. So I was looking at the example of systemic change in working with USAID. and the FCDO and all of these national development agencies. I think that that's important and we have to. But I think that part of the problem is that we solely see this through the lens of a national system. And so long as we see this through the lens of a national system rather than a global system, we're going to have huge, huge challenges. And if you factor into account that our governments are incredibly polarized, that they are very, very chauvinistic in many parts of the world, we should be worried about these issues. Let me just summarize where I think we all agree.
Yeah.
We agree that we need differentiated mandates. I agree that we need to have our institutions work with local communities. We agree that we need new price points to enable training on a global scale. We agree that the focus should be on human capital and the knowledge structures. And we agree on systemic change. But here's the difference. And here's where I think we need a big debate on. So the real debate we need to ask is, do we establish campuses in other parts of the world? Or do we work with local institutions in other parts of the world and develop them so we create skills? Because we've got hundreds of millions of people in Africa, young people that need to be trained. African universities are not at a capacity to train them on scale. There just isn't enough universities, there isn't enough capacity. But what we need to do is empower those institutions to use our capabilities to expand that capacity. So there must be models where we actually establish campuses. I have no problem with that. But when we establish campuses and weaken local institutions because we drain talent out of them, then we have a problem.
Sure.
And if you look at the examples of the last 20 years, that's happened in many parts of the world. So I think instead of simply looking at this through a national lens, or simply looking through this through the lens of a single institution, we have to look at it at a global systemic level.
Sure.
We need global institutions to think through these things in much more differentiated ways. And frankly, we need a multiplicity of actors and a multiplicity of business models that do this. And that's where I think we need a real rethinking of the Global Academy, the Global Academy's responsibilities to training global talent, and how to do so in alignment with local communities in a way that this is all sides can actually benefit. This doesn't have to be a zero-sum game.
Yeah.
And that's what I think we should be concentrating.
Absolutely. And I'm going to throw that question right back at all the panelists. And it takes us back to square one, doesn't it, Professor Smith? But I want to add into that cauldron the AI complication. And now what appears to be divisions in terms of how we are progressing on AI.
Yeah, so I thought we might be able to get through an hour without talking about AI, but we've failed. We've failed hopelessly. I will answer that question, but I want to come back on a point that Professor Habib has quite rightly raised, which is to have a kind of sensitivity to the kind of local market and understand, if you're doing transnational education, that there shouldn't be a monolithic model, that it needs to be very sensitive to the type of market that you're going in. And what I mean by that is it needs to be seen as additive to the local activity, and in a way help develop that local activity, not be seen as weakening local activity. Because if it does that, it's probably failed in one of its key missions. Because it shouldn't just be seen, transnational education, the social value of transnational education should be seen alongside the economic value of doing it. And therefore understanding in a very sensitive way what the local market needs, enhancing the local market and bringing talent in so it's additive is absolutely crucial, because if it's seen as just purely competitive, it actually won't work, and it will actually be counterproductive. So I think Adam was right to raise that point, and therefore it needs to be introduced in a very careful way. Now, in your point about AI, where do you kind of start on a topic like AI, other than to say it is likely to change the nature of the delivery of the educational model? And I don't think I'm being particularly prescient in predicting that. However, the question is how, because in some ways, of course, elements of pedagogy will always be human-to-human interaction, but making the overall model of higher education more efficient and more learner-centered is what AI offers us. Now, what that looks like and how you kind of enact it is I think a very active discussion across the whole of the educational world. But it's definitely going to change the model, and I hope in a very positive and enriching way, as opposed simply to be seen as simply a displacement for jobs.
Yeah.
Which I don't think it will be. I think it will just be additive. The only other thing to say is, of course, one of the things that's often forgotten when AI is discussed is, although it can answer many questions, it can help change the model.
Yeah.
It has a very big price to pay, which is in its environmental footprint. AI algorithms, particularly most AI algorithms which are run off large language models, are hugely energy intensive. So it's not a free good in that sense. And we have to properly factor in the full price. And what I don't mean price just in a monetary sense there, I mean what it does to the planet in implementing AI models. And I hope that the environmental issues are tackled along with some of the pedagogical issues as AI is introduced into education.
Yeah, I think all of you are going to mark me down, given you are academic people, for not remembering where I got this quotation, but I will say it anyway. So I saw someone saying on the internet that the only people whose jobs are going to be taken by AI are those who don't use AI. Professor Kaka, I want you to come in. Sneha, I want you to come in, and I want you to answer in part to what Professor Habib raised in terms of not ignoring the local issues. But I also wanted to add into that equation the issue of the global campuses that you're talking about. And it brings me back to my question around the complication that's being caused by the fracturing of geopolitics. Professor Kaka, if I can start with you, and I'll come to Sneha here in studio.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with Professor Habib. Is actually, not transnational education is not the only solution and role that universities can play in actually building capacity across other countries. May take different forms, but I think also the point about national agenda is very relevant here as well, because in the case of Dubai, a vision was actually to establish an international education hub, and that's primarily not only to attract top quality education and research for the nationals, but obviously there's quite a large expat population which used to actually finish school here in Dubai and leave to their own country and go to other countries for higher education. So actually there was a real desire to keep talent, but also to actually expand education tourism, to attract international talent into the economy here. And as a result, this was a very, very successful experiment here, and we've got more than 30 international universities right now here, and the majority, over 50% of the students study with international universities. Having said that, from my experience in working in transnational education here for the past 15 years, and as you see global campuses mature and develop, there's always the opportunity to actually collaborate with local indigenous universities, through research and other types of activities. So it's kind of transnational education also help in develop collaborations and partnerships with the local context as well.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more about the need for us to break down national boundaries.
Yeah.
But I think national boundaries are a construct of maybe the sort of my generation and older, and also governments who are trying to keep power.
Yeah.
But if you look at where the future is, if you look at sort of the youth, and that's a global phenomenon with social media and access to sort of online information, that they're not thinking nationally when they think about their future and how they're going to get educated.
Yeah.
They're using YouTube and TikTok and Udemy and Khan Academy and all of these other global platforms to really educate themselves and start to build ideas and businesses out. And so I actually think whether or not we choose to go build it, the youth are building that and they're using it. And so it's actually our choice to lean in and do more of that. And then there are physical models as well that show the power of a transnational view. And so African Leadership Academy, which is headquartered right here in Johannesburg, is a Pan-African institute. And so there are students brought in from all across Africa and taught about Pan-Africanism, about entrepreneurship and leadership. And then they're sent to the US, which is sort of mostly to the US, to university, on the sort of condition that they come back and they build businesses in Africa. And so they're already creating a global education model, giving people the best of breed from all over the continent. And 78% of their graduates actually come back and work in Africa, which is breaking the myth that people used to have that once you send the kids overseas, they're not going to come back. And so they're actually coming back because they're being taught about the importance of coming back and building on this continent. And so I think this idea of breaking down boundaries is a really good one. But actually, if we don't lean in, we're going to get left behind.
Yeah. I need to talk about the role of NGOs as well as other non-profit organizations. But I just had a follow-up question on the issue of the idea floated by, I think it was Professor Habib who spoke about that global academy idea. Is there a place for something like that in your view? Absolutely. And how would it look like?
I think there's going to be multiple, I don't know if it'll be one global academy, right? But I think there's multiple ways that we can think about education globally.
Sure.
And if I can bring the AI piece back in to this one, I think the way that you personalize it and you make it global is that through technologies like AI, because you can then teach in someone's specific language at the pace of learning that's appropriate to them. And if you look at Khan Academy, they've got this coach called Khanmigo, which is an AI-driven coach. It doesn't give students the answers, but it coaches them at their pace and it'll be in their language. And so if you think about what it's going to allow you to have global academies all over the world in every type of subject and every type of sort of focus area.
Yeah. And the issue of the nonprofits?
So I think nonprofits, because they're focused so heavily on fundraising, sort of they can't really focus on how do they have scale by themselves. And so them working with for-profit organizations that really can bring them distribution and scale, can bring them funding, can bring them strategic partnerships, as well as working with startups that are really solving for the hardest issues on the ground in local markets. I think that combination is really important because nonprofits absolutely have a role to play, but they can't do it by themselves and they can't rely on just aid or sort of philanthropic funding to have impact.
Especially in a world where national politics is becoming more noisy, if I may put it lightly. Professor Kaka, I wanted to come back to you and explore the idea of the private sector in all of what we are talking about and how we integrate them in building the kind of platforms that we're saying would be necessary for us. I think almost fighting the politicians to a degree, but really thinking about things from a global lens. And then I wanted you to explore as well the idea that you raised earlier, how the national lenses in many cases, of course, make this conversation difficult.
Yeah, I mean, obviously the private sector, particularly industry and potential employers of students, with all that is taking place in developing in technology, there need to be quite a strong link between academia and industry and to try and influence the curriculum. In fact, actually, we probably no longer talk about just closing the skills gap, but it's actually the goalpost is changing. The skills required for the graduates to join and make an impact in industry in this changing world is actually changing. And so we need to continue to have that link and involvement to understand more the requirement of industry. But it's actually coming back to the private sector and the role of private sector, which is being played here in transnational education. In fact, actually, when the idea of developing an education hub here in Dubai came out, is actually the recommended model was to encourage international universities to join force with local private education provider or an infrastructure provider. These companies do obviously have quite a strong knowledge of the market. They have good connections with the communities, with government. They know the regulatory framework. So it was a good and attractive proposition to try and actually attract international university to come and join. And through their knowledge of the market, they can actually assess the opportunities and obviously take calculated risks to develop an international campus. So it's been quite a very, very we've got a number of examples of these partnerships, including our own here in Dubai, and they've been very, very successful.
Yeah, let me get the thoughts of Professor Habib and Professor Smith. Professor Habib, if I can start with you.
I'm going to raise three problems, and I want to preface my comment by saying I'm not being disagreeable, but I do think that we need to think about these issues because we are trying to reimagine higher education. The first is I think we need to be worried about the numbers of people who leave the country of the global south and don't return. So here's the Carleton University
22%.
data.
I had 22%.
No, well, let me tell you what. 85%, this is Carleton University's analysis, 85% of students who leave India to go study overseas never return.
Sure.
The number in Africa is between 80 and 90%. The two exceptions are Singapore and China post-2007. I don't know what has happened post-2019, 2020. But the data shows that the more people leave to train overseas, less they return. Now, I don't want to get into an argument of the far right that prevents student mobility. But I do think we need to train on scale. So if we're training hundreds of thousands, we need to train hundreds of millions. So you can compensate for both student mobility and the generation of human talent. And so that's the first thing that I think we look. The African Leadership Academy is a fantastic example, but it's a small niche operation. It doesn't train hundreds of millions of people. And so we need to figure out how we use public institutions globally to train on scale. The second is local campuses are important. But take the Qatar example. They established an education village. But have they, take Georgetown University or Northeastern or Northwestern in that case, and tell me, are those university campuses the same as what they have in the United States? There are serious questions about them being serious, capable institutions, training on scale, and creating the educational hub that we are talking about. Sure. Now, I don't want to say there isn't a role for that. But I do think we need a multiplicity of models, and we need to think through what other modular arrangements need to be established.
Yeah.
Because in Qatar, it hasn't achieved the ambitions that they claim they are.
Sure.
Georgetown's got a beautiful campus. Others have got a beautiful campus. But there is no way that they come close to the scale of the campuses that exist in the United States. And I think that that's something we need to factor in. And then the final thing I wanted to put onto the table is private sector universities are important. I think there's so much of demand. We need to use the technologies. Yeah. We need to use AI. We need to reinvent higher education. And we need the private sector and the NGO sector involved. But if you want to build research universities, research-intensive universities, there's very few private sector models that build the kinds of research universities of a Harvard, a Cambridge, an MIT, a University College London, a Southampton, etc. And that's because even the American institutions are non-profit institutions. Harvard is non-profit. Yale is non-profit. And so in a sense, you can bring the private sector in training human talent.
Yeah.
But if you want to build research universities, they have to be in many ways underwritten by global cash and by national cash.
Sure.
Public cash. And so that's something we also need an honest conversation about.
Yeah.
And that's, we're not having those kind of nuanced conversations sufficiently at a global level.
Absolutely. Professor Smith, you want to come in? So many points raised there by Professor Habib.
Yeah, and so there's some really interesting points raised there. So let's do the research and scale first. Yeah. Because it's absolutely right that it's very difficult to reproduce the scale in a branch campus and reproduce it to produce an identical model, particularly at the level of research intensity. But in a way, you can say you don't need to do that because it depends how you integrate the branch into your overall operation. Because if it's seen to be a proper integrated part of the University of X, then you've got the research scale, back in the main campus. So, for example, there are some facilities that, that leading research universities have that you cannot reproduce, or it makes no sense to economically reproduce them. However, that doesn't mean you cannot have a model that allows access to them and allows that access in a very integrated way. And in fact, that's one of the ways I think research is going to become more efficient, that you don't have a proliferation of highly expensive facilities across each national country having to have its own. Now, there's going to be certain things that people will want to reserve to the local, national, sovereign capability. Yeah. But there are some things that you're going to have to copy. You're going to have to share and not copy. So I think that's absolutely right. The second thing, but that's a big challenge to make that operate correctly, and therefore needs to be thought about very carefully. The other point that was being made by some of the other contributors was about the interaction with industry, and I think that's on several levels. Clearly, the pace of change means many industries, the skills they actually need are things that they're going to have to probably take some responsibility for delivering themselves. Because if we try and satisfy every industry's need individually, then it's going to be too complicated for us. But there are generic skills we can teach which allow people to learn new skills. And I think universities should be good at that, of making people aware of how they need to learn properly. And therefore it makes it easier to do that. However, there's also a differentiation between undergraduate education, postgraduate taught education, and then postgraduate research education. Because postgraduate research education, absolutely, some of it, not all of it, because some of it's very fundamental, some of it should be seen to be in direct partnership with industry. Right. Because industry can pose, let's call them real world questions. And therefore, and they have people who are really expert in a particular area themselves. And more of that is being done. And there's no reason that has to be within national boundaries. Right. I think particularly governments and research funders from governments need to develop more bilateral, trilateral, multilateral schemes to allow industry, NGOs, and research universities to work together more seamlessly to attack global issues. Yeah. But there's a little bit too piecemeal at the moment. Yeah. Thank you. Sneh, many points. I don't know what you want to pick on, but I wanted to pick up on those figures around who returns. Were those AFL figures? Yeah,
those were ALA figures. Okay. And so I think it proves the model that actually when you do it right, when you teach the kids early enough about how to solve the problems, they don't run away from the problems, they want to come back and fix them. And so, and actually loved Professor Habib's point. I actually think they're all really good points and they're good fuel. I've got an entrepreneurial soul, so whenever anyone talks to me about problems, I'm like, oh, opportunities. These are all opportunities for us to fix as we think about the future of education. And one that like really captivates my imagination, and I don't have the answer, but maybe will spark somebody's thinking on, is this idea of research universities. Because if you think about what is Africa's issue, right? And why have we always been seen as the poor continent? It's actually because we don't take advantage of our own resources and create production here. And so whether it's oil or natural resources, such as sort of like chrome and diamonds and everything else.
Don't go far away. Remember, South Africa is the largest producer of platinum and the largest platinum reserves in the world. And yet, what do we do with our platinum? We ship it off.
Yeah, and so imagine if you could create research universities around creating sort of the future of AI back on Africa. So like semiconductors. Right now, Taiwan and the US and China are all locked in this battle for who can actually have an advantage here. we have all the resources that are needed to actually make semiconductors here. We don't have the talent and the research facilities to do that yet.
Right.
But what if we were actually able to invest in this? And this is something that would be in the interest of every government here to actually collaborate on, to really bring the whole continent up.
Yeah.
And so I think when we look at these big problems and we actually look at what does it mean in terms of opportunity and what could it mean for the future of Africa if we could actually turn this problem around and look at it differently.
Yeah.
And I think the other sort of question for me is one of scale, because I agree with Professor.
Wanted you to answer the scale issue as well.
Yeah, because I think Professor Habib's right? We have these little pockets of ideas, and startups are exactly the same thing. They've got these great ideas, they solve it for one local community, but how do we take that and grow it globally? I don't think scale is you need one big player to solve it all. I think scale is about connecting the dots better.
Sure.
So can we connect African Leadership Academy better with organizations in the US or Singapore that are doing those things, and then help them scale? And therefore, things that look like they're quite immature right now, like maybe global campuses of a leading US university, those things can get better the more you improve the connectivity between them and sort of
I was actually going to come back and ask you the question, how do we scale African Leadership Academy? Now you've sort of answered me in part.
Well, part of it is this idea of connectivity, and part of it is the learners that go through there that are creating businesses that then create scale. So 1,500 students have been through African Leadership Academy, right? It's a drop in the bucket, but if you start looking at that over time, and what they're actually building, it changes completely the scale of it. And if you want to see like what happens on the other side of this, look at EDC. It started in the 60s as an answer for the US trying to get dominance in the STEM education field. And now it's become this global charity that's working around the world, and they've affected 100 million learners around the world, right? So these things can scale, but you have to have the connectivity and the ability to work with others to make it happen.
Absolutely. I want us to start wrapping up. So I want you guys to think about consolidating your messages into, number one, some of the issues, ancillary issues that came up in our discussion, but returning to our core question that we asked at the beginning, and this was, how do we collaborate to ensure that we are able to advance education? Professor Kaka, I'm coming to you.
I'll do that, but just a couple of words on the research point, because it is indeed a challenge, and to establish a research capacity at an international campus, at least to have some research activity is indeed a challenge. And often what you find is actually it's the research intensive university. They are the ones who are invited to open campuses across the world. So I think what I've seen throughout the years, international campuses can indeed play a role in helping in demonstrating impact of research that could take place in the home campus, but is actually connecting with the industry and demonstrating our community and demonstrating impact, a global impact of research that take place is very, very important. Of course, PhDs as well as helps with students doing research in the context, in the local context as well, is very, very important. But just to wrap up from my end, I think actually we are actually in a good position because what we do is we don't really need to lobby for. I think industry believes in what we do, government believes in what we do. So it's kind of the door is open for partnerships and collaboration. I think it's just a challenge is finding common grounds where partnerships can't actually be sustained. We can invest in partnerships, but they can be sustained and actually can flourish.
Sure. Professor Habib?
So I think what we have is we all agree on the importance of differentiated mandates. We all agree that we need a multiplicity of models. I think one of the real problems is this conversation is concentrated at national levels, and we need to open up a conversation at the global level. I think that partly the universities do so, and some of the private sector does so, but there isn't enough public bodies. I would love a more broader discussion in UNESCO, in the UN, about how to harness national governments' agendas to create a global platform of learning, to create an alignment of synergies and strategies, to do that, and there's not sufficiently now. And the thirdly is I would love some global, multiplicity of global private sector institutions enter this market, because we need some disruption, positive disruption, I mean. And frankly, we just don't have enough of it to get new business models of higher education playing out on a global platform.
So sorry, quick follow-up question on that would be, how do you square that with the AI race and what we have seen so far in terms of how the US and indeed many national governments are trying to harness what they have and protect what they have from other countries being able to get their hands on the technology?
I think that there's two parts to that. One is I think AI could transform education and the pedagogy of learning quite dramatically. We've heard one of our panelists speak about that. That's a fantastic case. And I think we need to harness that. But secondly, I also think what was also raised was I think that African countries are missing a point, a game here, where as this race emerges between China and the United States, and perhaps even Western Europe, there is a capability for countries in the global south, parts of the majoritarian world, that can rise to start servicing the research, but also private sector development around semiconductor industries that can provide training, that can provide production scale on high-level chips. It does require significant investment. It requires the private sector, the public sector, and the universities coming together. If I was sitting in government, that's what I would spend an enormous amount of attention, because it touches the future, but it also builds all of the pipeline required for training on scale.
I like the challenge. I really do like the challenge, especially when you speak about the Africa challenge in particular. And then, of course, as you mentioned, the global south. And we know the countries that are there and the numbers that we're talking about. Professor Smith?
Yeah, so I think going back to what this whole session's about, it's about partnership. And I think one of the things to reflect on is why you work in partnership. You work in partnership because you can do things that you couldn't otherwise do alone or singly, and that requires, I think, a lot of careful thinking about why you enter partnership. And I think it's absolutely clear that there are many challenges that sometimes it might be better to walk away from and say, it's too complicated. But I don't think that's the right thing to do, because all the partnerships I've ever been involved in, even the ones which have been difficult, have actually been enriching, and they've taught us more about our organization and what our organization needs to do itself to become a better organization. So I think, wanting to do research in partnership or education in a T&E model, some of the high level challenges that Professor Habib has set us, I think, are really exciting. But they can only be delivered through partnership. They cannot be delivered. And that means partnership between governments. It means partnership between different parts of society within those. And then it means cross-boundary things. So I think it should be wanting to enter partnership for a positive outcome that ends up as a win-win. Because, too many partnerships are entered into, in my opinion, too many partnerships are entered into by saying, what do I get out of this? Now, clearly, you've got benefit. But if that's the only reason you're going into them, then I think you're starting from the wrong place.
And integration of the private sector collaboration in itself, on its own, or with national governments, or with national universities. How do you see that?
Well, I think that all types of things need to be tried. But I would say that the important words that we use, I absolutely buy into, which is positive disruption. Because you can get some systems, higher education systems, underperform, and they underperform because there isn't sufficient challenge. You could also say there isn't sufficient resource, but you can always normalize for resource. And I think one of the questions that makes a system work, why has the US system been so successful? The US system has been so successful for such a period because it has public institutions, it has private institutions that are for profit, and it has private institutions that are not for profit. And it has there are some examples of working with industry. you know, in a very integrated way. And I think basically it's the multiplicity of solutions.
Yeah.
And therefore, I hate to bring this word in late in the discussion, but often this comes down to regulation.
Right.
And governments being prepared to regulate in the right way to allow the right type of behavior and partnership.
Yeah, absolutely. And I also heard the word UNESCO, which we didn't develop far enough. Sneha, you have the last word.
Sure. So I think if we think about why education matters, Madiba probably said it best when he said education is the most powerful weapon by which you can change the world. And we're all trying to change the world here. Yeah. And so I think that's the reason why people want to get into partnership, because the opportunity for us to actually reimagine all of the structures and systems and challenges and opportunities has never been greater. Yeah. And if we start thinking about the future of education, what I'd love to see us reimagine not just early childhood or university level education, but also education for adults who maybe have missed and sort of closing the opportunity gap for adults. Right. And so right in South Africa, there's a really cool startup that's just early stage. It's called Nubi, that's working, for example, with SMEs to become business coaches and educators using AI and on their phones. And so actually, if we can start closing that gap and help SMEs become much more successful on the continent and educate them that way. There's also another startup called Chisel right here in South Africa that's coaching students. And so that if they don't have a great teacher at school, they don't have great access, they can get coaching sort of through an app. Sure. And so if we can start using some of those solutions and start reimagining how we think about delivering education, I think we could be onto something amazing, and then we will actually change the world.
I want your thoughts on number one, the UNESCO intervention. Do we need UNESCO to coordinate globally some kind of platform that we use to try to advance education and hopefully help to dampen these nationalistic tendencies that we are seeing developing around the world?
I think any multinational organization can be helpful because they naturally just bring together parties of different stripes and colors around a common theme. But I don't think it's just, you know, one named organization. I don't think necessarily it's UNESCO or WEF or, you know, any other organization that you might think about. I think all of us have a real challenge in front of us, which is when we are trying to go down a path and solve for a problem, are we looking around us at who else is moving in the same direction and figuring out if we can actually amplify each other's efforts or accelerate? Right. And I think that's really where it has to start and finish. We can't rely on one organization, no matter how big and how global, to actually do that for us. I think it's really on us to
My final point would be to you, as a person of the private sector who has moved into the NGO sector, but is still commercially active, to ask the question around the involvement of the private sector and what kind of role that it plays in building the kind of platforms that we're talking about, the collaboration that we need.
I think one of the panelists said it best, which is that the world is changing at such a pace that organizations cannot keep up with the skills and talent that they need. And so they naturally having to lean into education, whether it's education or re-education of their own employees, or finding the next generation of talent, or figuring out how to reach the next generation of their customers. Education is really important. And so I think private sector, by necessity, is leaning into this, and therefore will make amazing partners.
Absolutely. Let's not forget the next generation of workers is going to come from Africa. So many insights, very little time, unfortunately. That's where we have to leave this conversation for now. Partnerships for impact, strengthening the collaboration between governments, academics, civil society, private sector, and international organizations. Once again, let me thank my guests in the studio with me, Sneha Shah, board member, African Leadership Foundation and Development Center, Professor Amar Kaka, President and Pro-Vice Chancellor at Curtin University, Dubai, Professor Mark Smith, President and Vice Chancellor, University of Southampton, sir, thank you, and Professor Adam Habib, Vice Chancellor, SOAS. Let me not forget that he is an African son who is sitting somewhere in London. Thank you all very much for your time and for listening. Goodbye.